think we can get started. And, this isn't going to be just me staring at the camera for an hour. I'm going to chat to you guys as well. But hopefully, safe intervals. Hello, Nilani. I'll try and at least get a few sentences out before I get distracted. So, yes, Mr. Browser and the Brain Sharpeners by Philip Curtis. Chapter 1. First contact with the Brain Sharpeners was made on a foggy morning in February, but Michael Fairley insists that Mr. Browser, Class 8's teacher, was in distant communication with them before that. It seems that a few days earlier, Michael had been standing by Mr. Browser's desk, half listening to an explanation of how to do long division sums, when Anna Cardwell came out with a broken pencil. Anna is a round-faced girl with large, innocent-looking eyes, but she's one of the champion pencil point breakers in the class, especially when there are sums to be done. "Please, Mr. Browser," she began. "Hello, Dan." "Don't tell me, Anna, your pencil's broken." "Yes, Mr. Browser. Could you sharpen it for me, please?" Mr. Browser shook his head wearily as he looked at the broken off end, but he took his ancient penknife from his pocket and set to work on the pencil. "How are you doing with the sums, Anna?" he asked. "I don't think I really understand them, Mr. Browser," Anna answered honestly. "Nor does Michael," said Mr. Browser. "If only I had a brain sharpener as well as a pencil sharpener, maybe we'd learn a little more." I did think that, actually, a little more quickly. Yeah, why is he sharpening with a penknife? Anna giggled, but Michael was looking at Mr. Browser's face as he was speaking. As soon as Mr. Browser spoke the words brain sharpener, Michael was sure that his eyes took on a glazed look, and he stared into space as though he were listening to something far away. "I thought he had indigestion," said Anna, when asked to confirm this. "He suddenly held the knife still and stared, as if Michael and I and the rest of the class were not there for him anymore. After a few seconds, he clicked back into consciousness again and gave me back my pencil." "Hello, Aunt Ben. I'm reading Mr. Browser and the Brain Sharpeners." "Brain Sharpeners," said Mr. Browser, as though the idea appealed to him greatly. "We could certainly do with some for this class. Nice children, but they will not listen. I've said this before, Michael, haven't I?" "Yes, Mr. Browser." "At least 100 times. He's always saying it," thought Michael, and tried harder to listen as Mr. Browser began to explain once more about the sums. Several days passed before the events happened which changed Class 8 and Mr. Browser completely. In that time, Michael and Anna had forgotten all about the unimportant incident with the penknife. Mr. Browser was always making little jokes like that. They helped the mathematical medicine to go down for some of the class. Since then, Anna had broken off 2 more pencil points, but had sharpened the pencils herself because she was afraid that Mr. Browser would think she was overdoing it. Monday was the day on which it was unusually foggy. Oh, I remember the fog. Doesn't turn people inside out. Michael arrived in the playground very early that morning. Thank you, Sloop. At around 20 minutes past 8. This happened because his mother started work very early on Mondays, and she always took Michael to school by car because Chevy Chase School lay on her route. I'm sure that must be a pun. Also, Michael was so forgetful and untidy, so she said, that she was pleased to know for sure that he'd arrived at school in one piece. So on this foggy day, Michael ran down the path to the playground, happy in the knowledge that no one else would be there. He enjoyed having the playground to himself. He could run without fear of being knocked over, and he could play marbles against himself without any danger of losing. Best of all, he could occupy the climbing apparatus and swing around as he wished without upsetting anyone else. He made straight for the climbing frame and clambered up to the topmost bars. It was pleasant, usually, to sit there and look down on the empty playground and the deserted school. Even the precise headmaster, Mr. Salt, would not have arrived yet. His shining new car would usually be the first one to arrive in the car park at about 8:30. The fog had changed the usual scene completely, and Michael was, to his own surprise, a little uneasy as he sat and looked around at his kingdom. The fog seemed to be closing in on him. The houses adjoining one side of the playground were completely hidden, and fog was swirling around the dustbins at the far end of the playground. He couldn't see the football posts in the middle of the school field, and even the school building itself was hazy. Thank you, DJ Moo, thank you for dropping in. For once, Michael wished that someone else would arrive. It would be good to hear another voice. The fog was dampening sounds and making the world a mysterious place. If only Spiky Jackson or Jason Little would come running across the playground towards him. It was cool at the top of the climbing frame, with the fog swirling around him. I had pizza this evening, I've got a bit of indigestion. And he began, that's not in the book, that's just real life. And he began to consider how he might occupy himself when he climbed down to the playground again. He was about to drop to a lower bar when he thought he heard the wind blowing from the direction of the field. He stopped climbing down and frowned. Wind and fog don't go together, he was thinking, when all the fog on the field seemed to start blowing towards him. Clinging to the cold bars as the fog swirled past him as if being puffed out by some giant smoker, he was aware of a whirring sound, followed by a sudden plop and hiss, rather like the noise when a hovercraft comes ashore and deflates. For a second or two, there was a gap as the fog was blown away, and through the gap Michael saw a huge white thing with windows in it, sitting in the middle of the school field. Then the fog closed in again, and the sudden wind died away. Michael climbed down and walked across to the edge of the field. Hard as he stared, there was nothing to be seen but fog. He shivered, as much with excitement as with cold. The thing had looked most like a giant pepper pot, and the holes near the top of it were probably windows. Had a plane landed on the field? Michael didn't want to admit to the truth, but deep down he knew that either his eyes had deceived him, or he had seen some kind of spacecraft. No aeroplane on Earth had ever resembled the object he had seen. As far as he could tell, the playground was still deserted. If only someone would come, he could tell them what he'd seen. But would he be believed? Not a hope, he decided unhappily. So the only way in which he could prove to himself that he'd not been dreaming would be to walk across the middle of the field and take another look for himself. He put one foot on the grass, then withdrew it. To walk on the school field before 9 o'clock was to break one of the strictest rules, and it might even result in a caning. Mr. Salt hardly ever used the cane, but there were stories of times when he had done so. As the field was very wet and muddy, he certainly wouldn't be pleased to hear his rule had been broken. Excuses. If he didn't dare go out there, he would never know the truth. He might be missing the biggest sensation of the century. A look around to ensure himself that he was still alone, and Michael stepped courageously off the asphalt and moved slowly over the grass, looking and listening intently as he went. Was there a faint ticking coming from the place where the thing had landed, or was it his imagination at work again? He stopped, listened, and moved on. Now the playground was no longer visible, and he was lost in a sea of fog, with no buildings in sight. He was on his own with whatever might be standing there on the football pitch. No buildings in sight, but suddenly there it was. I don't want to become famous. That's why I'm reading an obscure book from childhood. Where were we? Was there a faint ticking coming from the place where the thing had landed? Oh no, no buildings in sight. But suddenly there it was, the pepper pot object, hovering a few inches from the ground and ticking like a grandfather clock. Swift rays of light started shooting out of it, so that Michael was caught in a kind of tunnel of light which reached from the pepper pot to himself, and no further. He intended to... That's all right, Chaz. He intended to turn and run, but his feet wouldn't obey him, and as he stood there against his will, a door opened in the side of the pepper pot, revealing a collection of illuminated gadgets in the style of a huge computer. A platform rose up just inside the doorway, and on it there appeared a miniature pepper pot, exactly the same size as the big one, but having a large aperture in front of it, the purpose of which was soon revealed to Michael. "Boy," began a dry voice coming from the hole in the little pepper pot, "you are in the class of Mr. Brausser, are you not?" "I am," replied Michael, and the machine repeated his words in its harsh voice. Then followed a whirring and clicking. Evidently the machine was translating the English into its own language. A pause, more whirrings, and the machine was prepared to speak again. "Boy, inform Mr. Brausser at once that the Brain Sharpeners have answered his call and say that they want to see him. He must come at once, and you must tell no one else that you have seen anything out here. We are already constantly checking on your brain, and we shall know before you speak exactly what you intend to say. If you are tempted to tell of what you have seen, be warned. We have the power to make you unconscious before the words even leave your mouth. Now, fetch your Mr. Brausser." "But he probably isn't here yet," protested Michael, trembling all over. The little pepper pot whirred and clicked. "I'm glad, guys." "Go and wait for him," it said. "He is approaching the school gates now. Depart at once." The light from the big pepper pot died away, and the fog swirled around Michael once more, thicker than ever. In a couple of seconds the big pepper pot was hidden completely. Michael turned and ran diagonally across the field, in what he thought was the direction of the car park. His sides were aching by the time the asphalt of the path around the school came into view, but he dared not stop. The only car standing in the car park was the headmaster's sleek Rover. Michael ran past it and down the drive towards the school gate. Mr. Brausser's old Wolseley 1500 swung into the entrance just as Michael arrived there. Mr. Brausser braked sharply and wound down his driving window. "Michael, what are you doing out here? On a foggy day like this, too? You're breaking the school rule, and worse than that, you're asking to be knocked down. Back you go to the playground at once." "But Mr. Brausser, I've a message for you. Somebody wants to see you." "Come down to the car park then, Michael, and I'll talk to you. If we stop here, there might be an accident." So Michael ran alongside the old car until Mr. Brausser had driven it into its usual place in the car park. "Now, boy," he said, picking his briefcase up off the seat and climbing out. "Who wants to see me so early in the morning? Mr. Salt?" "No, Mr. Brausser. There's something out there on the field, and it asked me to fetch you immediately." "It? What do you mean, it?" "Well, it's a kind of spacecraft, I suppose you'd call it. Looks like a big pepper pot, and there's all sorts of computer equipment inside." Mr. Brausser stared at Michael. "Look here, Michael Fairley," he said. "It's only February, not April the 1st. Stop trying to fool me. Were you watching a space film last night?" "I'm not fooling you, sir. I'm not. Please, Mr. Brausser, I had to make sure that you would come. Please go out onto the field and you'll see for yourself that I'm telling the truth. They call themselves the Brain Sharpeners, Mr. Brausser." "The Brain Sharpeners?" Something registered in Mr. Brausser's mind. He stared hard again at Michael, and saw that the boy appeared to be trembling. "All right, Michael." "Oh, thank you, Jen." "All right, Michael, I'll take a look. But if I find there's nothing there, you can expect a hard day's work." "Yes, Mr. Brausser. Over there in the middle of the field." "Aren't you coming with me, Michael?" "Oh no, Mr. Brausser. It's you they want to see. You alone." It seemed to Michael as though his words had been directed by some power beyond himself. "Calm down, Michael. You'd better go back to the playground." Mr. Browser strode off into the fog. Michael, as soon as Mr. Browser disappeared, returned along the edge of the field to the playground, which was now filling up with children. "Where have you been, Mike? What are you doing on the field? Your shoes are covered with mud." His friend Jason Little, who I've decided is a bit common, confronted Michael with these questions, and Michael hunted frantically to find an answer. He would dearly have liked to have told Jason about the pepper pot. I mean, they're all a bit common. But he dared not. He fancied his brain became dizzy at the very thought of revealing the truth about the Brain Sharpeners. "I've been chasing a seagull on the football pitch," he said weakly. "It couldn't see me in the fog, and I nearly caught it." "You're daft," commented Jason. "Come on, let's have a game of marbles." "It's too cold," objected Michael. "Not as cold as standing there and staring into the fog." "Oh, leave me alone." All right, I will." Jason found it hard to believe that his friend meant what he said, but at last decided that he did, and ran off to find some more reasonable companions. Michael was left staring out into the fog, listening hard to see if he could hear any of the sounds which had come from the pepper pot earlier. All was quiet on the field, and his listening was not helped by the noise coming from the children playing in the playground. Now and again his classmates tried to persuade him to join in a game, or darted past him with such comments as, "What are you looking for, Michael? Never seen fog before?" He ignored them all and gazed intently into the fog, because by now he was becoming worried about Mr. Browser. Perhaps he should never have passed on the message to him. Suppose the Brain Sharpeners had lured him into the giant pepper pot and made off with him. Made out with him, that'd be worse, wouldn't it? I mean, that's Mr. Browser. Michael looked at the playing children near him and was about to risk walking out onto the field again when a piercing whistle brought all the children to a standstill. Miss Toms, the deputy head, was on duty. She had come to the middle of the playground in order to be able to see as many of the children as possible, and she was glaring round as though the children themselves were to blame for the fog. "No one will move till I say so," she threatened them. "Now, classes 1, 2 and 3, lead in." The smaller children set off for the entrance door, and Miss Toms moved towards the field just as Michael made a half-hearted attempt to disappear into the fog on the field. "Michael Fairley," shouted Miss Toms, "don't you dare move. One more step and you can go straight to my room." Everyone knew that to pay a visit to Miss Toms in her room under such circumstances was an event to be avoided. Miss Toms took a hearty dislike to anyone who disobeyed her, and set out to make the culprit's life unpleasant for at least a week. Therefore, Michael stood still, and left Mr. Browser to his fate. Gradually, Miss Toms worked her way up the year groups, until finally Michael's class number was called, and he reluctantly joined his friends in making for the door. "Your shoes are very muddy, Michael," stated Miss Toms as he passed her. "You've been out on that field, haven't you? Stand still while I'm talking to you." "Yes, Miss Toms." "Yes? Why, Michael? Why?" This time Michael found a more acceptable story. "I ran to fetch my ball, Miss Toms." "Where's your ball now? Seems as though you were digging while you were looking for it from the amount of mud on those shoes." Miss Toms favoured him with one of her sharpest looks. "One of my friends has it," countered Michael. "Oh well, get along and see you wipe those shoes well at the door." "Yes, Miss Toms." How Michael wished that he could have told Miss Toms the truth. Perhaps for once she wouldn't have been so sure of herself. More probably she would have sent him straight to her room for being cheeky. He tried to console himself with the thought that one day she might find out the truth from Mr. Browser, if he came back. He was the last to enter the classroom, after being delayed by Miss Toms and by the thorough cleaning of his shoes. He found Class 8 making the most of the absence of Mr. Browser. Spiky Jackson, known thus because of the spike of black hair which was once again standing up straight from the crown of his head, was about to throw a paper dart, and Jason was risking an indoor game of marbles with Elmer Smith on the floor. Anna Cardwell was doing a dance in front of the blackboard, and several of the girls were standing in what Mr. Browser called Gossip Corner, where the coats and slipper bags were kept. Stevens, are we going to go through every single class member? Stephen Simmons was busy preparing his action man for an attack on Sarah Mount's doll, and Jennifer Charman and her friend Alison Gilpin, both mad about horses, were fixing saddles on two lifelike models. It is important that we know every single character and their first name and surname. Graham Skene was about the only one who looked as though he might be working, but if you looked more closely, you would have seen that he was lost in a picture strip about a space adventure. Michael saw this as he passed by, and was tempted to shout to them all to be quiet. Hello, Hardcastle Industries. Because outside on the field, a real-life space adventure was going on, and Mr. Browser was caught up in it. But even as he entertained the thought, he felt a little dizzy. The Brain Sharpeners were keeping in contact with him. This frightened him, and he sat down at his desk with his head in his hands. Whatever is going on here? The oldest children in the school setting such a bad example to the rest. I suppose I couldn't expect Class 8 to come into school and settle down to work on their own. Sit down, all of you. The thunderous voice belonged to the headmaster, Mr. Salt. He crossed the classroom to Mr. Browser's desk and banged his fist down on it. Just because Mr. Browser isn't here, and he looked around sternly to see where Mr. Browser might be, we don't expect you to behave as though it's a holiday. Take out a book, each of you, and see that you're quiet until he comes. Meekly, the class obeyed, and after a minute or two, Mr. Salt decided that he could safely leave them. As he walked across the classroom, it occurred to him that he himself had not seen Mr. Browser that morning. Has anyone seen Mr. Browser? He asked. To Michael's relief, there was silence at first. He's at school, Mr. Salt. I saw his car in the car park, and I saw him talking to Michael Fairley. I was coming down the road by the car park at the time. Indeed, said Mr. Salt, intrigued. Michael, was Mr. Browser talking to you? Yet you haven't put your hand up. What was he talking about, and where did he go afterwards? Michael was confused, and perspiration appeared on his forehead. Please, Mr. Salt, he was only talking to me for a moment. He told me to go back into the playground. And where did he go himself? Out onto the field, Mr. Salt. Indeed. And why do you suppose he did that, Michael? It seems an odd thing to do. Please, sir. Well, Michael? Michael's head fell forward on the desk. Please, Mr. Salt. Michael's fainted. Mr. Salt hurried to Michael's side, and to his surprise found that it was true. Michael was slumped, unconscious, over his desk. Open the window, give him air, the headmaster commanded, and quickly loosened Michael's tie and shirt. You're all right, lad, he said, as Michael groaned a little and began to come round. Haven't you had any breakfast? Perhaps it's the fog that upset you. I was only asking you about Mr. Browser. I'm not going to punish you, though of course you shouldn't have been in the car park. I shall have to ask Mr. Browser about that when I see him. Broccoli Dan, thank you for the resub. I am here, Mr. Salt. Hello, Lauren. All the class, including Michael, turned and looked towards the doorway where Mr. Browser was standing. How odd he looks, whispered Anna. Just like when... Ah, Mr. Browser, said the headmaster. We were just trying to find out where you were, and Michael here suddenly became ill. I think he's better now, though. Perhaps you'll take over the class. I have a parent waiting to see me downstairs. Of course, Mr. Salt. I'll look after Michael. I'm all right, sir, said Michael, who had begun to feel much better as soon as he saw Mr. Browser had come back safely from his visit to the Brain Sharpeners. As for Mr. Salt, his main concern was that Mr. Browser was back to take the class, and he didn't bother to ask him where he had been. Anna, however, was still curious, and as soon as the headmaster had gone, she risked putting a question to Mr. Browser. Where have you been, Mr. Browser? Please tell us. She was ready for a mild rebuke from Mr. Browser, but she was far from prepared for what happened. "From now on," declared Mr. Browser in a grating voice, "you will cease to be impertinent, You will cease to be impertinent, Anna Cardwell, and you will settle down and concentrate on your work. Your ignorance is appalling, as is that of the rest of the class. I am going to turn this class into the cleverest set of children in the school. Yes, the cleverest. Not only in this school, but in this country, in the whole of Europe, and the world." "What a hope," muttered Spunky Jackson. Muttered Spiky Jackson, and half the class burst out laughing. "Enough," ordered Mr. Browser. "The time for jokes has passed. This morning, just as a beginning, we will learn all our tables to perfection, so that in the days to come we shall be able to work on the complicated mathematics we shall be learning. Books and pencils ready, not a second is to be wasted." Silently, the children took out their books. Michael took the opportunity to look into Mr. Browser's eyes, and the change that he saw in them told him everything. The Brain Sharpeners had taken full charge of Mr. Browser. End of chapter 1. Well, chapter 2 is quite short, so I think we can get on with chapter 2. And, maybe that'll be where we leave it. Mr. Salt, the headmaster of Chivy Chase School, was a tall and serious man who wanted, even demanded, that everything and everybody in his school should be perfect. It was said that when he walked in the grounds of the school, each blade of grass stood up straight and the birds all sang in tune. So what he had seen in Mr. Browser's classroom, such things as Spiky Jackson throwing his paper dart and Anna Cardwell dancing in front of the blackboard, and many other activities, couldn't be bothered to list everyone in the class this time, upset him very much indeed. He blamed not only the class, but also Mr. Browser for not being with his class at the right time. He returned to his room and immediately buzzed through to his secretary, Miss Copewell. "Fetch me the files on the children in Mr. Browser's class, please. Oh, and bring with you any letters of complaint about the class which we have filed away." Miss Copewell knew from the tone of Mr. Salt's voice when the headmaster was especially upset, and when she brought the files in, she saw that he had taken his glasses off to clean them, as if to have a clear look at whatever misfortune was in front of him, which was another bad sign. He rubbed away hard at the lenses. Miss Copewell put the files down on the headmaster's desk and departed without saying a word. Mr. Salt scanned the class list. A likeable lot, he thought. And admittedly Mr. Browser had no one with genius in the class to work upon. When it came to brains, Class 8 was certainly a normal sort of class. He flicked through the cards, picking out a selection of them, including the ones of those children whose parents had for some reason written in to complain about their children's progress. Sandra Axford, slow worker. Yes, thought Mr. Salt. All she has in her head is hairdressing and dancing. Peter Brymore, football mad. Yes, agreed Mr. Salt. The boy has a crick in his neck through looking out of the window when other classes are having games. Anna Cardwell, loves acting. Mischievous, hates writing and maths. Better put in likes dancing too, decided Mr. Salt, recalling Anna's dance that morning. Jennifer Charman, horse mad. There were several like that. Jason Little, careless, plays about with marbles. True. Mr. Salt had 20 of Jason's marbles in his drawer, and he blamed Mr. Browser for not taking them off the boy more quickly. Simon Jackson, in trouble in and out of school. Does not concentrate. Mr. Salt could only shake his head. Then there was the boy Fairley, who was quite bright and enjoyed writing science fiction stories. Funny how he had fainted. A bit of a dreamer, the headmaster decided. He gave a little groan and pushed the rest of the files away from him. The unread ones, he knew, would resemble the ones he had read in many ways. Still, Mr. Browser should be stricter with them. And why hadn't he been in the class at the right time? Mr. Salt decided to go back to the classroom after assembly and have a word with him about it. With luck, he would catch him when the class was noisy, and then he would have an extra excuse for being critical. As soon as assembly was over, he returned to his room and waited for a while, so that Class 8 could have time to settle down. Then he carried out his intention and strode down the corridor to see Mr. Browser. He was somewhat surprised when he reached the classroom door to hear no sound coming from within. He took a quick look inside and saw all the children bent over their books, and Mr. Browser striding up and down the rows with a very severe expression on his face. Mr. Salt turned and crept away. He would find a better time to give his message to Mr. Browser and the class. About every half hour he returned to the room, but still, to his surprise, he was greeted with complete silence and 100% concentration on work, even from Spiky Jackson. It was uncanny. Too good to be true. Well, Mr. Browser had evidently sensed the headmaster's anger and was doing his best to make up for it. I must give him credit where it is due, thought Mr. Salt. And after playtime that afternoon, he didn't bother to visit Class 8 anymore. This was a pity, for just before the end of the afternoon, Mr. Browser began to relax and to look and act more like his old self. Once or twice he went to the window and stared out of it with a puzzled expression. Michael, too, was able to think of other things than the Brain Sharpeners, and began to feel better. "Close your books and put them away," Mr. Browser ordered to the class at the end of the afternoon. Desks were tidied, and each boy and girl sat up straight, waiting to be dismissed. Mr. Browser stared at a point over the tops of their heads. "Tomorrow morning, if it's foggy," he announced, "we shall be going out onto the school field in order to measure exactly how far we can see in the fog." "Hurrah! Hope it's foggy," was the reaction of Spiky Jackson. The announcement was greeted with enthusiasm by all except Michael, who shivered as though he were already out in the fog. "You may lead out," said Mr. Browser, and soon all of the class had gone except for Michael, who was sitting at his desk staring at Mr. Browser. "Well, Michael," said Mr. Browser uneasily. "You're going to take the class out to that pepper pot thing," said Michael. "They've told you to bring us out into the fog, haven't they? They make the fog themselves, Mr. Browser. Did they take you inside that thing? What did they do to you, Mr. Browser? And what do they want to do with us?" Mr. Browser stood in front of Michael, a struggle going on inside his brain. "Yes, Michael, they let me enter their craft. They want us all to go in there tomorrow, so that they can begin a course which will sharpen and extend the brain power of all the children in the class, and will give me the ability to teach at a very advanced level. They showed me all their equipment. Each child will have a sort of helmet put on his head, and rays which will develop the brain will be shot into their heads for 10 minutes. Gradually the length of the treatment will increase, until each brain will be capable of receiving knowledge direct from the Brain Sharpeners, without my help, Michael. Michael, there's no knowing now how you will end your days. Maybe you'll become a great scientist, or even a leader of the people. The secrets of the universe are going to be made clear to us." "I wish you'd never thought about the Brain Sharpeners," declared Michael. "Why are they doing all this for us? What do they want from us in exchange?" Mr. Browser looked down at Michael, as though his brain had just returned to Earth, and frowned. "You'd better go home now, Michael," he said, "or you'll be late for your favourite TV programme." End of chapter 2.